The Voice to Parliament is a federal advisory council proposed by an Assembly of Indigenous Australian elders who came together in Central Australia in 2017 and produced the Uluru Statement from the Heart. In the statement, among other things, and I do encourage you to read it, it's an extraordinarily beautiful, deeply meaningful and exquisitely succinct document, was a proposal that the Indigenous peoples of Australia have a voice, a national representative advisory body enshrined in the Australian Constitution. Now, my non-Australian followers, and that's most of you, might be wondering why Indigenous Australians don't already have a national representative body. Well, they do. The National Indigenous Australians Agency is the latest in a string of such bodies that have been set up, disputed, ignored, discredited and abolished since the 1970s, when the Australian government first thought to actually consult Indigenous people instead of regarding them as a mere administrative problem. So what's different about this proposed new body? We're going to put it in the Constitution so it can't be abolished. We can't change the Constitution without a referendum because we have to know the majority of the nation is on side with ensuring that while the government of the day can limit the powers of the National Aboriginal Advisory Body, they can't abolish it. They don't have that power. There always has to be an Indigenous voice to Parliament. Now, we all know how these things go. They sound highly commendable on the page, but they're all too easily rendered ineffective. What's the point of the voice if it's just another advisory body that the government doesn't have to listen to and hardly ever will? Listen up now, because the answer to this is really important. What matters at this point is not the quality of the mechanism. The Uluru proposal, taken up 2 years after the fact by the Labor government after the Conservatives ignored it, is an extremely politically savvy and even cynical document, the thinnest possible end of the wedge of Aboriginal sovereignty, the one point that could have a reasonable chance of passing a referendum in a nation overly populated with disengaged, ill-informed, self-righteous, history-denying Philistines. The Uluru Convention knew what they were doing. For First Nations Australians to recover a meaningful degree of self-determination, they need structural inclusion as an independent authority in the coloniser state's self-description. That meant they needed a change to the Constitution, and that meant a referendum. But the absolute most the nation at large would be likely to accept was the very least thing Indigenous Australians could ask for. So they did. Because now that it's been proposed, what matters is the actual vote. Australians coming together to say, yeah, look, 60,000 years of custodianship and organic knowledge does mean something. And given the mess we've made of our rivers, forests, land and climate since colonisation, Aboriginal people really should be guaranteed at least an advisory council, no matter who's in power. The Uluru negotiators recognised that the first, most difficult and most necessary step was to get that presence built into the Constitution, because only then will the First Nations people of this brutally colonised land have a real path to treaty. Of course, white Conservatives are against the voice, but the campaign for the yes vote has also run up against opposition from a handful of prominent Aboriginal figures, most notably one on the left, Senator Lydia Thorpe. A firebrand Aboriginal activist from a prominent activist family and a long line of strong, sovereign Black women, Thorpe entered Parliament with the Greens, but split with them when she came out against the voice and now stands as an independent. She's perhaps the most misunderstood person in Australian politics. Mercurial, sharp of mind and blunt of tongue, with an earthy glamour and limited regard for the authority of the coloniser state, Thorpe evokes strong feelings and hysterical press. People seem to love her, or more often hate her, with a passion. Thorpe was also present at the Uluru Convention until she led a walkout of the disaffected, claiming the convention had been hijacked by Aboriginal corporations and establishment appointments, and that it did not reflect the aspirations of ordinary Indigenous people. I've no doubt that's true, but I hope I explained in point 2 why, when you're trying to get white people to change their law, that's just how it had to be. There are also 1 or 2 conservative Indigenous public figures who are campaigning against the voice, but the less I have to say about them, the better. I think it's important to note that while Lydia Thorpe opposes the voice in its current form, in her first speech to Parliament, watch it, it's a cracker, she herself called for the other thing proposed in the Uluru Statement, makarata, a process of truth-telling and reconciliation. Another reason this proposal is important is that a council of Indigenous elders enshrined in the Constitution is probably the nearest the hundreds of clan groups across Australia can or should come to federating. Because in the white mind, or at least in Anglo history, sovereign powers are federal powers. So without an independent centralised federal authority, the Indigenous people of Australia lack the structural power to stand on a level with the government. That, of course, is what people like Tony Abbott are freaking out about when they liken the Indigenous voice to the British House of Lords. But also, this referendum has a backstory. Since Federation in 1901, Australia has had 19 referenda proposing 44 changes to the Constitution. They mostly don't pass, but we did pass the one in 1967 that allowed Aboriginal people to be counted as part of the population and made them citizens under the same laws as everyone else. Want me to go back over that? Until 1967, when I was almost 5 years old, Aboriginal people were not counted as part of the Australian population, and the federal government left all legislation covering them to the states. As perhaps you can imagine, dispossession and oppressive control were commonplace, and states enacted laws to enable mass removal of children from their families. But in 1967, Australia officially stopped pretending First Nations people were a temporary inconvenience and accepted them as citizens, in the process co-opting them into the coloniser state whether they wanted it or not. At the time, though, most did, or at least they accepted it, because this constitutional change amounted to a long overdue formal acknowledgement of Indigenous humanity, something up until then implicitly denied. 55 years later, it's time we acknowledge First Nations authority, their place as the people who were here before us, and their power as inheritors and preservers of the oldest continuing culture on the planet. There's one more important point to make. The Uluru Convention's other key proposal, as I mentioned, was for makarata, a peacemaking or reconciliation commission, to supervise a process of agreement-making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. This has been sidelined for now as stage 2, but it's critical to Indigenous healing because Australia is a nation built on lies. The country was empty when we found it. The people here were just fauna. They're no good. They have no culture. They're on their way to extinction. Plenty of white Australians still believe some version of this toxic shit, and we as a nation have a lot of learning to do, and it's not happening fast enough. Indigenous activists have been calling for treaty for generations now. Lydia Thorpe has been working towards clan-based treaties with the state of Victoria, but anything less than constitutional authority risks override by the federal government when the Conservatives get back in. I respectfully recognise the reasons why some Indigenous people are campaigning against the Voice proposal. But I beg you, when it comes down to the wire, to make a wise concession and vote yes. Because the harsh reality is that we will never get to treaty without makarata, and we won't get nationwide makarata if we don't get a yes vote for the Voice.